Empathy is commonly viewed as a strength, a gentle skill, a subtle kind of intelligence that enables people to connect with others on a deeper level. What is less often acknowledged, however, is that this same ability carries an unseen burden. When a person is highly attuned to emotional cues, they are not merely observing the world, they are continually interpreting it, taking it in, and holding it within their inner emotional landscape. At first, this may look like kindness, patience, or emotional generosity. Empaths listen when others do not. They understand when others criticize. They remain when most people choose to leave. Yet beneath this openness lies a limit that is rarely visible to those around them. It is not loud or dramatic, it is quiet, exact, and firm. When an empath is repeatedly exposed to emotional dishonesty, manipulation, or disrespect, something subtle begins to shift. They do not always confront or give warnings. Instead, their mind begins to sort experiences with a clarity that feels almost clinical. What once felt like connection starts to resemble emotional clutter. What once felt meaningful begins to feel exhausting. This is where their darker side appears, not through aggression, but through withdrawal. They do not pursue revenge, pursue peace. And when they determine that a person no longer aligns with emotional safety or integrity, they can detach with a sense of finality that feels almost unnatural to those who know them. There are no lengthy explanations, no emotional closure, only absence. This reaction is often misunderstood. People assume empaths will forgive endlessly. In truth, their forgiveness depends on emotional honesty. Once that honesty is repeatedly broken, their system adjusts, and when it does, access is removed. Not briefly, but entirely. What makes this impactful is not harshness, but clarity. Empaths often notice patterns others overlook. They identify emotional inconsistency quickly. They perceive intention. And once that awareness becomes fixed, they stop participating in emotional cycles that disrupt their inner balance. From a psychological standpoint, this is not weakness, it is self-regulation. It is the mind safeguarding its emotional capacity from overload. Yet for those on the receiving end, it can feel abrupt, even startling, because the shift does not occur through confrontation, it unfolds in silence. The message here is not to fear empaths, but to understand them. Emotional intelligence is not only about connection, it also involves discernment, and discernment eventually leads to decisions that cannot be undone. If there is one takeaway, it is simple. Emotional access is not permanent, it must be continually earned. And when it is lost, it is rarely announced, it simply fades away. Empaths do not become dangerous, they become unavailable. And in a world filled with emotional noise, their silence becomes the strongest boundary they can create. Empaths are individuals who experience emotions at a depth that goes beyond typical awareness, not only recognizing what others feel, but also absorbing those emotional states into their own inner experience, creating a constant interaction between their internal world and the emotional atmosphere around them. This heightened sensitivity allows them to form deep, compassionate connections, often making them seem like some of the most understanding and emotionally present people in any setting. Yet, what is often overlooked is that this same strength comes with an internal cost because every emotion they encounter leaves a mark that must be processed, held, and eventually released. When this emotional input becomes overwhelming or too frequent, it can strain their psychological system, pushing them into a state of emotional exhaustion where clarity begins to blur and self-protection becomes essential. At this stage, they start to develop stronger internal boundaries, not because they stop caring, but because they need to maintain their mental and emotional balance. This is when their behavior may shift in ways that others perceive as distant or cold, even though it is actually a form of regulation rather than rejection. When an empath reaches their limit of emotional overload, they may withdraw from conversations that feel manipulative, draining, or inconsistent. Instead of confronting or trying to resolve everything, they quietly step back and observe from a distance, allowing their emotional system time to recover. And if the pattern of emotional harm continues, they may come to a firm internal decision that further emotional investment is no longer worth the cost. This decision is not impulsive, but carefully formed through emotional awareness that recognizes patterns over time, identifying when a relationship or interaction no longer supports psychological safety. Once that conclusion is reached, they do not always communicate their exit. They simply remove their emotional presence. Can feel like a sudden disappearance. This is often misunderstood by those who expect closure or confrontation, but for empaths, closure happens internally, not externally. And once they detach, it becomes very difficult to regain access to their emotional space. Because their system values peace over explanation, stability over conflict, and clarity over emotional disorder, making their silence not an act of punishment, but a means of self-preservation that protects their deeper emotional awareness from further strain. An empath's emotional world is shaped by constant perception, where they are attuned not only to what people say, but also to what they feel beneath their words. This ability forms a highly sensitive emotional radar that continuously detects authenticity, tension, discomfort, and intention in every interaction. Over time, this awareness influences their personality, guiding them to prioritize harmony, understanding, and emotional balance, often placing others' needs before their own because they experience others' pain almost as if it were their own, making them attentive, patient, and deeply thoughtful in relationships. However, this same depth also creates vulnerability, as they are frequently exposed to emotional environments that are not always healthy or stable. When they take in too much emotional noise without enough recovery, their internal system reaches a point of saturation where every interaction begins to feel heavier than it should. Instead of continuing to engage in the same way, they gradually create distance as a form of self-regulation, not due to a lack of care, but because their internal balance. This shift is rarely obvious, as empaths do not typically express their overwhelm outwardly. Instead, they process it internally, slowly reducing their emotional involvement with situations or people that contribute to their fatigue. This is where misunderstandings often arise because others expect open reactions, discussions, or visible conflict. What they encounter instead is silence, reduced engagement, and, eventually, withdrawal. As this internal adjustment continues, the empath's choices become more guided by emotional clarity rather than immediate reaction, allowing them to focus on patterns of behavior instead of isolated incidents, observing how consistently they are treated and whether those interactions support or deplete their emotional balance. Once a pattern of imbalance becomes clear, they begin to distance themselves, not out of anger, but out of necessity, because for them, emotional safety is essential, not optional. This separation does not feel sudden from within, even if it appears abrupt to others, as it develops through a gradual internal process where trust slowly diminishes and emotional investment steadily fades until nothing remains to hold the connection together. At this point, the empath does not seek closure in the usual sense, as their sense of resolution occurs internally through acceptance rather than confrontation, leading to a final stage where they stop reacting to emotional input from that source, forming a lasting boundary expressed not through words, but through absence. This absence often carries more meaning than any explanation ever could, as it represents a complete internal decision to protect emotional integrity over continued exposure. Empaths function with an elevated level of awareness that enables them to sense not only what people express, but also what they conceal. This constant input creates a mental environment where every interaction becomes a form of emotional processing. Over time, this sensitivity builds a strong internal system for recognizing behavior, patterns, and intentions, making empaths highly perceptive individuals who can often anticipate emotional outcomes before they fully unfold. However, this same ability also places them under ongoing emotional strain, as they rarely have the chance to fully disconnect from what they absorb. As a result, their inner world becomes a space where external emotions are continuously examined, filtered, and stored, which can eventually lead to overload if they are not given enough time to recover. You are. When that overload reaches a critical level, their system instinctively begins to protect itself by limiting emotional intake, reducing engagement, and prioritizing inner peace over outward connection. As this protective phase begins, their behavior may shift in subtle but noticeable ways, such as responding less frequently, participating less emotionally, and gradually withdrawing from conversations or relationships that once held their full attention. This is not a sign of weakness or disinterest, but rather a survival response designed to prevent further exhaustion. During this stage, empaths become more analytical, focusing on consistency, honesty, and behavioral patterns instead of isolated moments of connection. This shift allows them to view relationships with greater clarity, often revealing imbalances or inconsistencies that were previously overlooked due to their natural inclination to empathize rather than judge. As these patterns become more evident, their internal decisions begin to shift, gradually reducing emotional investment in situations that no longer support their sense of stability or respect. Eventually, if imbalance continues, the empath reaches a point of firm internal clarity where detachment becomes necessary rather than optional. At this stage, they no longer engage in emotional negotiation or explanation, because their decision is no longer reactive but based on accumulated understanding, leading them to quietly and permanently step away from interactions that disturb their emotional balance. This withdrawal is often seen by others as sudden, but from the empath's perspective, it is the outcome of a long process of reflection and boundary formation, where silence becomes their clearest form of communication and absence their strongest boundary, allowing them to maintain emotional integrity while disengaging from environments that no longer support their well-being. Empaths are perception individuals by especially deep perceptions in innovation sits. Empaths. Empaths are individuals who experience emotional perception at an unusually deep level, where they are not only aware of others' feelings but are also subtly affected by them, creating a continuous exchange between external emotional signals and their internal state. This heightened sensitivity enables them to build strong emotional connections, often making them compassionate, observant, and supportive in relationships. However, what is less visible is the internal cost of this ability, as every emotional interaction is processed intensely, meaning that even small emotional signals can accumulate over time and lead to fatigue, especially in environments filled with instability, conflict, or manipulation. As this accumulation increases, their ability to remain balanced begins to weaken, not due to a lack of strength, but because their system is constantly engaged without enough rest or separation, eventually pushing them into a state of internal adjustment where self-protection becomes a priority over external engagement. As this adjustment progresses, empaths gradually shift their behavior in ways that may not be immediately obvious, but are significant in terms of emotional boundaries, such as investing less energy in conversations, becoming more selective about the environments they engage in, and subconsciously distancing themselves from interactions that feel repetitive, draining, or inconsistent. This is not a decision driven by anger, but a gradual realization formed through accumulated experience, where they begin to recognize patterns in how they are treated and whether those patterns support or disrupt their internal balance. As these patterns become clearer, their response shifts from engagement to observation, meaning they begin to analyze rather than absorb, creating a natural buffer between themselves and external emotional influence. At a deeper level, this marks the beginning of emotional detachment, where they no longer respond with the same intensity because their system has already determined what is safe and what is harmful. This awareness leads them to gradually withdraw emotional access from situations that repeatedly create imbalance, not as punishment, but as preservation, allowing them to maintain clarity and stability over time. During this phase, they may appear distant or less responsive, but internally they are reorganizing their priorities, choosing peace over participation and clarity over confusion, which eventually leads to a state of controlled emotional distance where they remain aware but no longer exposed. In the final stage of this process, the empath reaches complete emotional disengagement, where they no longer feel the need to explain, justify, or revisit situations that have already been processed internally. This creates a silence that others may misinterpret as sudden absence, even though it is the result of a long and careful internal evaluation. At this point, their emotional boundaries are firmly established, and they operate from stability rather than reaction, where access to their emotional world is no longer automatic, but must be earned and maintained through consistent respect. Once that respect is repeatedly broken, the empath does not escalate conflict, but instead withdraws completely, using absence as their most powerful form of emotional intelligence, ensuring their internal balance remains protected even in the face of external disruption.